Imagine believing you need to endure this brutal, sweat-drenched boot camp just to lose fat. And then you discover that the absolute best tool for changing your body composition is literally just putting one foot in front of the other.
Welcome to TalkKast. I mean, it is such a massive cultural blind spot. We are completely hardwired to punish ourselves.
I guess we are entirely conditioned by that whole no pain, no gain culture. Like, if I do not feel completely destroyed by a workout, I honestly just feel like I'm wasting my time.
Right. We see all this marketing that equates total exhaustion with progress. But when you look at how the human body actually manages energy and recovers, you realize you simply do not need that massive strain on your nervous system.
I have to push back on that immediately. If I go for a walk and I'm not breathless or lying in a pool of sweat, my first thought is that I am cheating. How is a gentle stroll actually doing anything compared to a high-intensity interval class?
Well, you are touching on the exact thing that confuses people. We conflate the acute feeling of muscle fatigue with actual total energy expenditure. To understand why walking is so powerful, we really have to look at the endocrinology of stress.
Okay, so what actually happens when we do those brutal, high-impact workouts?
Your body perceives it as a highly stressful event. You get microtears in your muscles, your nervous system is deeply taxed, and your body spikes cortisol, the stress hormone, to manage that acute physical trauma.
And cortisol is notoriously linked to holding on to fat, especially visceral fat. So are we creating a hormonal environment that actively resists the fat loss we want?
Exactly. A spiked cortisol environment can easily lead to water retention and increased appetite. You usually need a day or two just to fully recover. But walking sits way below that stress threshold.
Because there is virtually zero joint pounding, I guess.
Right. It is remarkably gentle. It does not trigger that massive cortisol spike at all. You can walk for 45 minutes today, wake up tomorrow feeling completely fresh, and do it all over again without overtraining.
That makes a lot of sense from a consistency standpoint. You are basically trading peak intensity for relentless frequency. But let's look at the math. A 30-minute brisk walk burns like maybe 100 to 200 calories. That feels like a total drop in the bucket compared to doing burpees for half an hour.
Standing alone, it absolutely is a smaller drop in the bucket, but you have to zoom out. You have to look at the compounding effect of low-fatigue exercise.
How do you mean?
Let's say your burpee session burns 400 calories, but you are so physically wrecked that you can only manage to do it twice a week. That is 800 calories burned. Now take your brisk walk, burning roughly 150 calories.
But because I am not fatigued, I can easily do it 6 days a week.
Precisely. That is 900 calories.
Yeah.
You are quietly piling up a bigger calorie deficit. Plus, walking does not trigger those massive hunger spikes that ultra-intense workouts often do.
Right, so I am not leaving the gym ravenous and just eating back everything I burned, which actually brings us to this whole idea of the fat-burning zone. We see it on treadmill consoles all the time. Is it a real thing or just marketing?
The fat-burning zone is a very real physiological state. It is usually called Zone 2 cardio, and it corresponds to roughly 60 to 70% of your maximal heart rate. There is a very specific standardized way to calculate this based on your heart rate. To find your fat-burning zone, you first calculate your maximum heart rate. You take the number 220 and you subtract your age.
That is easy enough to figure out.
Let's use a 40-year-old as a worked example. 220 minus 40 gives a maximum heart rate of 180 beats per minute. The fat-burning zone is 50 to 70% of that maximum. So 50% of 180 is 90 beats per minute, and 70% of 180 is 126 beats per minute. Therefore, a 40-year-old would aim to keep their heart rate roughly between 90 and 126 beats per minute.
And just a quick note for people listening, you can find the exact formula for calculating your max heart rate along with an example right in our description. But what is actually happening at that percentage?
At that specific moderate intensity, your body preferentially sources its energy by oxidizing stored body fat rather than heavily tapping into carbohydrates.
Why does it play favorites, though? Why does it prefer fat at that specific speed but switch to carbs if I decide to sprint?
It all comes down to oxygen availability and the urgency of the energy demand. Think of your body's energy stores like fuel for a fire.
Yeah.
Burning fat is like heating your house with thick oak logs.
So they have a massive amount of potential energy, but they take a while to catch fire.
Exactly. Breaking down fat is a slow, oxygen-rich chemical reaction. When you are walking briskly, you are breathing steadily and delivering that constant stream of oxygen to the fire. But if you suddenly encounter a steep hill and sprint up it, the energy demand spikes instantly. The oak logs are simply burning too slowly for that.
So what does the body use instead for that explosive energy?
It throws highly flammable newspaper onto the fire. That newspaper is glycogen, your stored carbohydrates. It can be broken down much faster without needing a ton of oxygen.
That makes perfect sense. But for those of us who do not have an expensive smartwatch, how do we know we're actually in that 60 to 70% sweet spot?
And honestly, the standard math formula is just a population average anyway. It can be quite inaccurate. A much more reliable method is the TalkKast. It measures your ventilatory threshold.
So the way I am breathing literally tells me what kind of fuel my cells are burning.
Yes. When you are optimally in the fat-burning zone, your breathing should be labored enough that you could not comfortably sing a song. But you should still be able to speak in short, complete sentences.
Okay, so if I can narrate an entire audiobook without pausing for a breath, I'm basically just taking a leisurely stroll.
Right. You are likely in zone 1, great for light recovery, but not optimizing cardiovascular adaptation. Conversely, if you can only gasp out 1 or 2 words, you have pushed way past zone 2.
And my body is heavily shifting toward burning the newspaper instead of the oak logs. Wait, I need to test the logic here because it feels like a mathematical paradox.
Go ahead.
If walking uses a higher percentage of fat for fuel than running does, why shouldn't I only ever walk? Like, why do marathon runners look so incredibly lean if doing a harder workout burns a lower percentage of fat?
That is the exact logical trap that catches so many people. The major flaw lies in confusing the percentage of fat burned with the absolute total amount of fat burned.
Can you unpack the math on that for me?
Let's run a practical comparison. Imagine you go for a 30-minute walk, perfectly dialed into your fat-burning zone. Maybe 60% of the calories you burn come directly from oxidized fat.
Which sounds fantastic, but walking for 30 minutes might only burn, say, 150 total calories.
Exactly. So 60% of 150 means you burn 90 calories of pure fat. Now imagine a vigorous 30-minute run instead.
Because the intensity is high, the body wants quick energy, so it shifts to burning carbs.
Right. In this scenario, maybe only 30% of the calories come from fat. But the run requires massive energy. You might burn 400 total calories.
Oh, I see it now. 30% of 400 is 120 calories from fat.
Precisely. Even though the percentage was functionally cut in half, the sheer magnitude of the total energy burned means the runners still burn significantly more total fat.
Okay, so if running burns more total fat and more total calories, why are we focusing so heavily on walking? Doesn't this just prove the boot camp people are right?
Not at all. And this circles completely back to our opening point about sustainability and the nervous system. The unparalleled value of walking isn't some mystical fat-melting property. It is highly sustainable.
Because most human beings simply cannot run vigorously for an hour every single day.
Exactly. Their knees will degrade, Achilles tendons will flare up, and motivation will completely collapse under the fatigue. But almost anyone can walk at a brisk pace for 45 minutes every single day.
That makes total sense. So over a month, the walker burns vastly more total calories simply because they never needed a rest day.
You hit the nail on the head. So let's translate this into execution. We keep using the word brisk. What does a genuinely brisk pace actually demand mechanically from the body?
Yeah, because a brisk pace in a busy city looks very different from a brisk pace somewhere else.
Biomechanically, it is roughly 3 miles per hour or about 100 steps per minute. But the absolute best internal gauge is the feeling that you're going to be 5 minutes late for an important meeting.
You are not quite jogging, but there is a definite, undeniable sense of urgency.
Exactly. Your stride lengthens slightly, foot strike becomes more deliberate, and your arms start swinging dynamically to counterbalance the momentum. Within 10 minutes, you should be breaking a light sweat.
Let's say I have mastered that flat ground brisk pace. It feels easy, and I want to increase the intensity to burn more calories without jogging and introducing joint impact. How do I up the challenge?
You weaponize gravity. You introduce incline walking. Walking uphill strips away the forward momentum that carries you on flat ground. You are now forcing your muscular system to actively lift your entire body mass upward.
I imagine that completely changes which muscles are being recruited.
It drastically shifts the mechanical load to your posterior chain. Your glutes, hamstrings, and calves are under immense tension. Even your core has to engage heavily just to keep your torso upright.
Which perfectly explains the massive viral trend over the last few years, the 12-3-30 workout.
It is a brilliant protocol. You set a treadmill to a steep 12% incline, set the speed to 3 miles per hour, and walk for 30 minutes without holding the handrails.
And because of that steep grade, the cardiovascular demand is immense, rivaling a jog, but the joint impact is negligible. But do I have to use a treadmill? Is there a physical difference between the motorized belt and real pavement?
There is a slight biomechanical difference, but it is not cheating. The physical effort to propel your mass upward still demands highly significant energy. The real difference is in the specific adaptations.
Okay, let's break down the controlled environment a bit.
The treadmill offers absolute total control. You dictate the exact speed and incline, and you are immune to the weather. If you want to perfectly mimic outdoor flat ground, you set the incline to 1 or 2%.
What does that 1% actually do?
It perfectly compensates for the lack of aerodynamic drag, the wind resistance you would naturally push through outdoors. But you do lose some functional adaptations by staying inside a sterile box.
What happens when we take that walk onto an actual outdoor trail?
The adaptations shift heavily toward functional stability. You are constantly making micro adjustments on uneven terrain, engaging stabilizing muscles in your feet and ankles that just go to sleep on a flat belt.
And I imagine the mental impact is completely different as well, engaging with an actual environment.
Yes, the concept of optic flow is crucial here. When you physically move forward through a landscape, lateral eye tracking naturally quiets the amygdala, the fear and stress center of the brain. It is a potent mood booster.
So outdoor walking is the superior functional movement, but the treadmill is the superior controlled laboratory.
Exactly. The scientifically correct choice is simply whichever environment removes friction from your day and guarantees you will actually do the work.
That is totally fair. Let's shift to how we fuel these walks. I have a scenario that happens to me a lot. I step onto a treadmill, set a steep incline, and feel like a titan for 10 minutes. Then boom, I hit an invisible wall.
The sudden, violent mid-workout crash.
Yes. My legs literally feel like lead, I get lightheaded, and I have to physically hit the emergency stop button. Why does that happen if we are supposedly just casually burning fat?
The culprit is almost never cardiovascular failure. It is an endocrine failure. It is a catastrophic drop in your blood sugar. Your working muscles simply ran out of accessible energy.
But wait, if I am in the fat-burning zone and I have thousands of calories of fat stored on my body, shouldn't my physiology just seamlessly switch over to burning those oak logs?
In theory, it should. But the transition from burning blood sugar to mobilizing stored fat is not smooth at all if your insulin levels are fluctuating wildly. Think of insulin as a strict traffic cop. When insulin is high, it actively halts the breakdown of stored fat. It tells the body to stop opening the fat stores because there's too much sugar floating around that needs to be dealt with first.
Okay, so what caused the traffic cop to panic in the first place?
Let's trace it back to what you consumed an hour before that treadmill session. Let's say you had a flaky croissant and a vanilla latte. That is a massive payload of highly refined carbohydrates.
Which triggers a rapid spike in my blood glucose.
And your pancreas responds by flooding your bloodstream with a huge surge of insulin to shuttle that glucose out of the blood and into your cells. So you have extremely high blood sugar and extremely high insulin.
And then I step onto the steep incline.
Precisely. That steep incline demands massive, immediate energy from your leg muscles, so they start aggressively pulling the available glucose out of your bloodstream to power the climb.
Oh, wow, I see the collision happening. A double draw scenario.
Exactly. Insulin is aggressively pulling sugar to store it, and your glutes are aggressively pulling sugar to burn it. This vacuum effect causes your blood sugar to plummet incredibly fast, dipping well below baseline.
So the fuel vanishes, my brain panics, and sends an immediate fatigue signal to protect my remaining reserves. That is such a clear explanation of the mechanism. So how do we actually prevent that double draw? What does proper fueling look like before a longer walking session?
You want to focus on providing your body with a slow, steady drip of sustainable energy, completely avoiding that sharp glucose spike. The ideal pre-walk nutrition involves complex, easily digestible carbohydrates.
With a little bit of protein or fat.
Yes, consumed roughly 1 to 3 hours prior. You're aiming for about 30 to 60 grams of carbohydrates, something like a banana with a small serving of plain Greek yogurt, or a bowl of oatmeal with berries.
So the complex structure provides a slow, controlled release of glucose, the insulin stays stable, and you completely avoid the crash.
Exactly. The traffic cop stays calm.
I have to stop you there, though, because that advice directly contradicts a huge trend right now. What about the intense hype around fasted cardio, going for a brisk walk first thing in the morning on a completely empty stomach?
The logic behind fasted cardio is incredibly compelling. When you walk in a fasted state after an overnight fast, your insulin levels are beautifully low.
The traffic cop is off duty, so to speak.
Right, because insulin is low, there's nothing blocking the mobilization of fat. So during the actual duration of that morning walk, your body is absolutely forced to oxidize a statistically higher amount of fat.
So it actually works. You are burning more fat. Why wouldn't everyone do this if the goal is fat loss?
Because you are only looking at a tiny 30-minute snapshot of a 24-hour metabolic window. Long-term clinical trials show absolutely zero significant difference in overall fat loss between fasted and fed groups.
Wait, really? That feels like a glitch in the matrix. If the fasted group burned more fat during the walk, where does the advantage go?
The body simply balances the books. It relies on a metric called the respiratory exchange ratio. If you force your body to burn more fat during the morning walk, it subtly adapts.
By burning a higher proportion of carbohydrates later in the day.
Exactly. The net 24-hour fat oxidation is identical. Plus, there are behavioral compensations. People often subconsciously reduce their incidental movement throughout the rest of the day if they were subtly fatigued from fasted cardio.
Or they eat an extra 200 calories at lunch because their hunger hormones are amplified, erasing the deficit entirely. So it always comes back to total daily calories.
It always comes back to the total systemic energy balance. Fasted walking is not a magic biohack. If you prefer it because you feel lighter, by all means continue. But if it makes you feel weak or limits your workout, it is totally counterproductive.
That is incredibly liberating for people who hate training hungry. So let's talk about the actual architecture of this habit. What are the concrete targets we should be aiming for when it comes to the volume of these walks?
The globally recognized gold standard target is 150 minutes of moderate intensity aerobic activity per week.
Which sounds like an intimidating mountain if you are starting from absolute zero.
It can sound daunting, but you can effortlessly deconstruct that volume. You can achieve that target simply by taking a 30-minute brisk walk 5 days a week.
And if finding a solid 30-minute block is impossible, can I chunk it into smaller pieces?
Absolutely. You can take a brisk 15-minute walk in the morning and another brisk 15-minute walk in the evening. Those separate chunks provide virtually the exact same cardiovascular and fat loss benefits.
Are you sure? I always assumed you had to keep the heart rate elevated for a long, continuous period to unlock the fat burning.
That is a lingering myth. Every single minute of elevated heart rate accumulates toward your weekly metabolic demand. The ultimate goal is just integrating daily, frictionless movement into your routine.
This naturally leads to an interesting debate. Is it better to chase the famous 10,000 daily steps metric on a wearable tracker, or just set a focused 30-minute timer for a dedicated walk?
They're essentially two sides of the exact same physiological coin. Tracking passive steps is a phenomenal behavioral tool for increasing your non-exercise movement.
Right, it gamifies the day. It motivates you to park further away or pace while taking a phone call.
Exactly. It keeps your general metabolic engine idling higher. However, steps alone do not guarantee intensity. You could accumulate 10,000 steps by slowly shuffling around your house all day.
And a slow shuffle clearly does not provide a robust cardiovascular stimulus.
Precisely. That is exactly where the timed, purposeful walks come in. 30 minutes of brisk walking ensures a sustained period of true aerobic conditioning.
So the ideal scenario is actually doing both. Hit the baseline step goals to avoid being sedentary, and use timed walks to hit the moderate intensity required to mobilize stored fat.
Doing both is the absolute metabolic sweet spot. But we absolutely have to address the elephant in the room. Walking is a powerful tool, but it cannot do the job entirely on its own.
You cannot outtrain a bad diet.
The mathematical reality is that it is incredibly easy to erase that elegant, low-stress energy deficit with just a few bites of food.
Right. If I burn 250 calories on a walk and then eat a 400-calorie blueberry muffin because I feel I earned it, I am mathematically moving backward.
You are in a surplus. Walking fundamentally must be paired with sensible portion control. But beyond diet, there is another powerful synergy: pairing your walking routine with resistance training.
Why is lifting weights important if the walking is already handling the fat burning? Doesn't lifting just make you bulky?
That is a persistent fear, but biologically inaccurate for most people. Walking is phenomenal cardiovascular exercise, but it does not significantly build muscle mass. Resistance training builds lean muscle tissue.
And muscle tissue is highly metabolically active.
Exactly. Every pound of muscle requires daily calories merely to exist. By building lean muscle, you permanently raise your basal metabolic rate. You are basically upgrading the engine capacity of your car so it burns more fuel even at a dead stop.
I have to ask the ultimate vanity question. Will this specific walking protocol finally get rid of stubborn belly fat?
It is the most frequently asked question in fitness. To answer it, we have to unequivocally debunk the myth of spot reduction. You simply cannot choose where fat leaves your body.
So doing 1,000 crunches will not burn the fat directly over my stomach.
It will build strong abdominal muscles, but they will remain hidden underneath the layer of fat. The body draws energy globally. When you maintain a systemic calorie deficit, your brain signals fat cells everywhere to release their stored energy.
How does that actually work mechanically? How does the fat physically leave the body?
Think of your fat cells like vacuum-sealed savings accounts holding triglycerides. Hormones trigger an enzyme that breaks those apart into free fatty acids. They enter the bloodstream, go to your working muscles, and undergo chemical combustion.
And what happens to the physical matter?
The byproducts are water and carbon dioxide. You excrete a small amount of water through sweat, but the overwhelming majority of the physical mass of the fat you lose is exhaled through your lungs.
That is mind-blowing. Every time I am breathing heavily on a brisk walk, I am literally exhaling oxidized carbon from my fat stores into the atmosphere.
Exactly, and the body pulls those triglycerides systemically from everywhere, based on your specific genetics. It requires patience.
So the belly fat will leave, but it might just be the last place your genetics decide to pull from.
Yes. But the excellent news is that walking is highly effective at targeting visceral fat.
Visceral fat being the dangerous kind, right? The hard fats stored deep within the abdominal cavity wrapping around the organs.
Correct. Visceral fat actively secretes inflammatory cytokines and drives metabolic disease. The receptors in visceral fat are highly responsive to low-intensity aerobic exercise. As your walking routine mobilizes triglycerides, it eagerly taps into that deep visceral fat.
So your metabolic health radically transforms long before you ever see a six-pack.
Exactly. Which brings up another very important point. When putting in this daily effort, the natural instinct is to step on the bathroom scale every morning to see if the math is working.
If I walked for an hour yesterday, I naturally want to see a lower number today.
And that is exactly where millions of people lose their minds. I strongly urge anyone to look far beyond the daily fluctuations of the scale. It is a blunt instrument that measures total gravitational mass, not fat.
Which includes muscle, bone density, water retention, and literally the undigested food traveling through your system.
Exactly. If you eat a meal heavy in sodium, your body pulls extra water into your cells. You might wake up 2 pounds heavier. But it is biologically impossible to synthesize and store 2 pounds of actual human fat overnight.
It is entirely impossible. And I suppose if you eat carbs, those get stored as glycogen with water attached too.
Right. Your muscles swell with glycogen and water, making you functionally stronger. But the scale jumps up wildly. If you do not understand that, the arbitrary number can be incredibly discouraging.
So if we completely ignore the scale, what are the true, honest markers of progress we should be looking at?
Notice how your clothes drape. Are your jeans looser around the hips and waist? Are you using a tighter notch on your belt? These are direct, undeniable measurements of changing physical dimensions.
And I assume performance metrics as well.
Absolutely. A neighborhood hill that used to leave you breathless might suddenly feel entirely manageable. That is profound evidence that your cardiovascular system has adapted.
And the psychological metrics too, like improved baseline mood, better sleep, stable daily energy without relying on caffeine.
Those are massive indicators that your fundamental physiological health is drastically improving. These non-scale victories are much more accurate reflections of true metabolic healing.
It really reframes the entire approach to physical fitness. The best fitness plan is definitively not the most punishing one. We simply do not have to go to war with our bodies.
We do not. Consistency will always beat intensity when it comes to long-term body composition. The absolute best fitness plan is simply the one you can show up for consistently without friction and without dread. Walking provides that perfect foundation.
It is a fundamental human movement that you can rely on for the rest of your life. It is available to almost everyone, and it starts right outside your front door. The next time you see someone casually strolling through the neighborhood, just remember, they might be quietly building a massive metabolic engine while everyone else is destroying themselves in a boot camp. Something for you to mull over the next time you feel the urge to sprint until you drop.
Thanks for listening to TalkKast.